I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from. You didn't buy a single thing on this table, so you can wait in the other room while the rest of us eat. Those were the words my son said to me on Thanksgiving evening, in front of his wife, my 2 grandchildren, and his in-laws, who had come all the way from Phoenix. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't look ashamed. He just pointed toward the hallway like I was a dog that had wandered into the dining room uninvited. My name is Dorothy Henderson. I'm 64 years old, and for the 18 months before that night, I had been living in my son's house, handing over nearly everything I had, believing with my whole heart that family meant something. I was wrong, but what my son didn't know, what neither he nor his wife had any idea about, was that by the time he pointed me toward that hallway, I already knew everything, and I had already begun to move. My husband Robert passed 2.5 years ago, very suddenly, from a heart attack he never saw coming, and neither did I. We had been married 39 years. We met in college, built a life together in Cincinnati, raised our son Marcus in the same neighborhood where Robert had grown up, and spent our retirement years gardening, traveling when we could afford it, and looking forward to grandchildren. When Robert died, it felt like the floor disappeared beneath me. Not just grief, though the grief was enormous, but a kind of vertigo, like I had forgotten how to stand up on my own. Our son Marcus was attentive in those first weeks. He drove up from Nashville, where he and his wife Renee had settled, and stayed for the funeral and several days after. He helped me sort through paperwork. He made sure the life insurance was filed correctly. He sat with me at the kitchen table and listened while I talked about his father, which was the only thing I wanted to do. "Mom," he said on his last night there, "you shouldn't be alone in this house. It's too much space, too many memories hitting you all at once." He reached across and covered my hand with his. "Come stay with us. At least for a while. Oliver and Sophie would love having you there. Renee would love it too." I had hesitated. Our house in Cincinnati was paid off. Robert and I had been careful people. We saved. We avoided debt, and we owned that home outright. It was the biggest asset we had, and I wasn't sure I was ready to leave it. But Marcus made it sound temporary, like a soft landing while I found my footing. And the idea of seeing my grandchildren every day, of waking up to noise and life instead of silence, was more than I could resist. I agreed to come for 3 months. 3 months turned into 6, and 6 turned into 18. Because somewhere along the way, the word temporary quietly disappeared from everyone's vocabulary except mine. The arrangement Marcus and Renee proposed in the beginning seemed fair enough. They had a 4-bedroom house in a good Nashville suburb, and they asked me to contribute $800 a month toward expenses. My monthly income from Robert's pension and my own small Social Security payment came to just under $2,000, which meant I'd keep around $1,200 for my prescriptions, my phone, my personal needs, and anything else that came up. Tight but manageable. I also owned the Cincinnati house, which I had begun renting out through a property management company for $1,200 a month, money that went directly into my savings account and gave me some cushion. What I didn't know then was that Renee had already had a different conversation with Marcus about that rental income. I would only find that out much later. The first several months were genuinely good. I helped with Oliver and Sophie before and after school. I cooked dinner most nights because I liked to cook and because it gave me something useful to do. I read to the children at bedtime and watched them become more attached to me with every passing week. Oliver, who was 7 then, would save things for me throughout the day: a joke he heard at school, a drawing he made, a question about why the sky was blue. Sophie, who was 4, had decided early on that I was her personal companion, and she followed me from room to room with the kind of devotion that only small children and golden retrievers are capable of. I was needed. After months of feeling invisible in my own grief, being needed felt like medicine. But Renee's warmth, which had seemed genuine at first, began to thin out around the 5th month. Small things. She stopped including me in plans until the day before, if at all. She began making comments at dinner about how exhausting it was to feed a full household, always said to Marcus. Never directly to me, but always while I was in the room. She stopped asking my opinion about the children's schedules and then complained, when I offered it anyway, that I was overstepping. Marcus, for his part, seemed to notice none of it, or chose not to. By month 8, the financial arrangement changed. Marcus came to me one Sunday morning while Renee took the children to her mother's house. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with the same posture he'd had as a teenager when he was about to ask me something he already knew I wouldn't like. Renee and I have been going through the numbers, he said. Everything has gone up. Groceries, utilities, the kids' activities. We think a more realistic contribution from you would be closer to $1,100 a month. I stared at him. $1,100. That would leave me less than $900 from my income. And with my blood pressure medication, my thyroid prescription, and my eye doctor appointments, $900 didn't go far. I said as much calmly, but clearly. Marcus, that doesn't leave me much. Between my medications and basic expenses, I'd be cutting it very close. He nodded like he'd anticipated this. You still have the rental income from the Cincinnati house, Mom. And there it was. He knew exactly what was in my savings account. He knew about the rental income. He had clearly been thinking about it as part of the household budget long before this conversation. That money is my security, I said, keeping my voice steady. Your father and I set that aside for emergencies, for my care if I ever need it. Mom, he leaned forward slightly. We're your care. You're living here. That's what family does. He paused. Besides, $1,200 a month for a room in Nashville is actually below market rate. We're not asking for anything unreasonable. It wasn't the number that hurt the most. It was the phrase below market rate. Like I was a tenant. Like the 39 years I'd spent raising him, putting him through college, sacrificing and working and loving him were simply not part of the equation. I agreed to the increase. I told myself it was temporary, that things would stabilize, that my son was under pressure, and didn't mean it the way it sounded. But I want to be honest about why I really agreed, and this is the part of the story I stayed silent about for too long because I was ashamed. I agreed because I was afraid, not of Marcus or Renee, but of going back to Cincinnati and being alone in that house again, with all those quiet rooms and Robert's reading chair still in the corner and nobody to cook dinner for. The grief I'd been outrunning since I came to Nashville was still there, waiting for me. And I wasn't ready to face it, so I stayed. And in staying, I handed them more power over my life than I ever should have. The months that followed were a slow erosion. My presence in the household shrank in proportion to the money they took from it. I stopped being included in family photos that went on the wall. My suggestions about the children's routines were either ignored or, worse, adopted without acknowledgement, as if Renee had thought of them herself. I was no longer introduced to their friends as Marcus's mother. I was simply Dorothy, who's staying with us for now. For now. I noticed that phrase too. Then came Thanksgiving. The week before, I'd asked Renee if she needed help with the cooking. She smiled and said she had it handled, that her parents were coming from Phoenix and she wanted to do everything herself. Fine, I understood. It was her home, her holiday, her in-laws. I spent the day quietly in the kitchen anyway, making 2 dishes, a sweet potato casserole and a cranberry walnut bread, because I had been making those things on Thanksgiving since Marcus was in diapers and because they were both his favorites. When dinner was ready and everyone gathered at the table, I brought my dishes out and set them among the others. Sophie immediately reached for the bread, and Oliver asked if he could have the casserole first before the turkey. Small moments. Normal family moments. That's when Marcus looked at the casserole dish, then looked at me, and said it. You didn't buy a single thing on this table, so you can wait in the other room while the rest of us eat. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Renee's parents exchanged a glance. Renee herself stared at her plate. Oliver's hand froze over the casserole dish, and Sophie looked between her father and me with wide, confused eyes. "I made 2 dishes," I said. My voice was quieter than I intended, but it was steady. "I've been cooking for this family for 18 months. Cooking isn't the same as contributing financially," Marcus said. "Renee paid for everything on this table. You want to eat? You can start pulling your weight." I looked at my son, this man I had carried, raised, loved without condition for 41 years, and I felt something shift inside me. Not break, shift, like a bone snapping back into place after being dislocated for too long. "What does my $1,100 a month cover?" I asked, "if not food?" The question landed differently than a plea would have. Renee's mother looked up sharply. Marcus's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected me to answer back. In the months of slow erosion, I had become someone who absorbed, not someone who responded. "That covers the household," he said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Then I am contributing financially," I said. "I have been, every single month." I set down my napkin and stood up. "I'm going to take my casserole dish back to the kitchen. Not because you told me to wait in the other room, but because I've suddenly lost my appetite." I walked to the kitchen, set the dish on the counter, and stood there for a moment, with my hands flat on the cold granite. My heart was hammering, but beneath the hammering was something I hadn't felt in a long time. I was done. I didn't cry that night. I went to bed early, and instead of lying there feeling wounded, I did something I should have done months earlier. I started thinking clearly. The next morning was the Friday after Thanksgiving, and the house was quiet. Marcus had taken the children to his in-laws' hotel for breakfast. Renee was in the shower. I had perhaps 45 minutes. I went to the small filing cabinet in Marcus's home office, the one he kept unlocked, because he'd never imagined I'd have a reason to open it. I wasn't proud of what I was doing, but pride had been a luxury I could no longer afford. In the second drawer, beneath a folder of car insurance documents, I found a manila envelope with a sticky note on the front in Renee's handwriting. "D. Next Steps." My hands were completely still as I opened it. Inside was a printout from a website, Maplewood Transitional Living, a senior care facility 40 minutes outside Nashville. Certain sections had been highlighted in yellow. Shared accommodations available, starting at $550 per month. Flexible month-to-month agreements. Family retains billing authorization for resident accounts. Family retains billing authorization. Behind the brochure was a 2-page document. At the top, in plain typed letters, Property Transfer Agreement 412 Birchwood Lane, Cincinnati, OH. My house. Our house. The home Robert and I had paid off together over 30 years. The document outlined a transfer of the Cincinnati property into a family trust, controlled jointly by Marcus and Renee, with a notation that the rental income would be redirected to a household management account. There was a signature line at the bottom, with my name already typed beneath it. They intended to have me sign away my home, and then move me to a shared room in a facility 40 minutes away, while the rental income from that home continued to flow into their account. I photographed every page with my phone. Then I put everything back exactly as I had found it and walked to the kitchen to make coffee, because my hands needed something to do. I want to describe what I felt in that moment, because it was not what you might expect. It wasn't panic. It wasn't even rage. Not yet. It was a strange, cold clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop hoping you're wrong about something and accept that you were right all along. I had felt, for months, that something beneath the surface of this arrangement was rotten. I had talked myself out of that feeling a dozen times. I would not talk myself out of it again. I called my friend Barbara that afternoon from the parking lot of a grocery store 3 miles from the house. Barbara and I had been neighbors in Cincinnati for 20 years. She had been one of the first people to sit with me after Robert died, and she was one of the few people outside this house who knew how difficult things had become. She picked up on the second ring. "Barb," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you not to tell me to calm down." By the time I finished telling her what I'd found, she was already pulling up the name of an attorney she knew, a woman named Carol Simmons, who handled elder law and estate planning out of a small office in Brentwood. She's good, Barbara said. She's direct, and she will not let them steamroll you. I made an appointment for the following Tuesday, telling Marcus and Renee I had a routine checkup. Renee offered to drive me. I told her the bus was fine. Carol Simmons was exactly what Barbara had promised, direct, unhurried, and completely unsurprised by anything I told her. This pattern is more common than people realize, she said, studying the photos I'd taken. The property transfer document is the most concerning piece. It hasn't been executed, which means you still have full legal control of that asset. But the fact that they drafted it tells us a great deal about their intentions. She walked me through everything with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this many times. We needed to act in a specific order, she explained. First, secure the finances. Second, arrange housing. Third, exit cleanly. She advised me not to confront Marcus and Renee before I had all three pieces in place. Not because I owed them a warning, but because a premature confrontation would only give them time to escalate. People who plan this carefully don't give up easily, she said. Once they know you're aware, they'll move faster. I nodded. I understood. Over the next 2 weeks, I moved quietly and methodically. I contacted the property management company in Cincinnati and changed the rental income deposit from my shared account with Marcus to a new account. I opened at a different bank, an account Renee had no knowledge of and no access. As with, I reviewed the power of attorney I had signed when I first arrived. The one I had believed was simply a practical safeguard, and discovered it gave Marcus authority over financial transactions on my behalf. Carol helped me revoke it and file the appropriate paperwork. I also had a long, honest conversation with Barbara, who had a spare room she had been meaning to convert for years. She lived alone now, since her daughter had moved to Atlanta. Her house was 2 blocks from where Robert and I had lived, in the neighborhood I knew better than any other place on earth. She offered me that room for $600 a month, which was less than half of what Marcus and Renee were taking from me. And she offered it because we were friends, not because she needed my pension to pay her mortgage. I almost cried when she said it. Not out of relief, though, there was relief, but because the simplicity of genuine kindness, after so many months of transactional love, was almost more than I could absorb. There were 2 things that made the departure harder than the logistics. The first was Oliver and Sophie. My grandchildren were innocent in all of this. They didn't understand what their parents had planned. And they loved me with the whole open-handed love that children offer before the world teaches them to be careful with it. Oliver still saved things for me. Sophie still followed me from room to room. The thought of leaving them, not just the house, but their daily lives, was a specific kind of grief I hadn't anticipated. I wrote each of them a letter. Not goodbye letters, but letters I sealed and gave to Barbara to hold until the children were old enough to understand. I told them that leaving the house had nothing to do with not loving them. I told them they were the best parts of every day I had spent there. I told them their grandfather would have adored them, and that I intended to be in their lives for as long as they wanted me there. The second hard thing was Marcus himself, not Renee. I had come to see Renee clearly, and I held no illusions about what she was. But Marcus was my son. I had watched him take his first steps on the kitchen floor of our Cincinnati house. I had driven him to his first heartbreak and back. Whatever he had become in this marriage, whatever compromise he had made of his own character, he was still the boy I had loved for 41 years. And writing a letter to leave on his pillow felt like something that should not have been necessary between a mother and her child. I wrote it anyway. I told him what I knew. I told him about the Maplewood brochure, the property transfer document, the billing authorization. I told him I was not angry, which was not entirely true, but I was working toward it. I told him that when he was ready to have an honest conversation, he knew how to reach me. I did not tell him where I was going. I left on a Wednesday morning in late December, while Marcus was on a work call and Renee was dropping the children at school. I had packed over 3 days, a few things at a time, hiding 2 suitcases in the back of the guest closet behind the winter coats. I called a cab. I made the beds before I left my own and both children's. which I had straightened every morning out of habit. I left a small wrapped gift on each child's pillow. A journal with a compass rose on the cover for Oliver, and a small illustrated book of constellations for Sophie, because she had recently become fascinated with the night sky. As the cab pulled away from the house, I did not look back. Not because I felt nothing, but because I felt too much. And looking back would have undone me. Barbara's house was exactly as I remembered it, from 20 years of neighborly life, slightly overfull, warmly lit, smelling of whatever she'd last baked. She had cleared the spare room and put fresh flowers on the windowsill. There was a framed photo on the dresser. One I hadn't given her, she had found it herself. A picture of Robert and me at Oliver's first birthday, both of us laughing at something outside the frame. I stood there looking at it for a long time. "Sit," Barbara said from the doorway. I made soup. The calls from Marcus started at 3 that afternoon. I let them go to voicemail and listened to them later, in order. The first was confused, almost gentle. "Mom, where are you? Call me back." The second was sharper. "We've been waiting for you to come home. The kids are asking, what's going on?" By the fifth, around 8 o'clock that evening, something had shifted. "Mom, I read your letter. I think you've misunderstood something. This isn't what you think. Please call me. It's not what you think." I had been waiting for that particular formulation. I called Carol instead. She had already received a message from Marcus asking for my whereabouts. She had informed him, calmly and professionally, that I was safe, of sound mind, and had left of my own free will. She told him that any further contact should go through her office, and that any attempt to access my accounts or the Cincinnati property would be handled accordingly. Marcus and Renee showed up at Barbara's house the following evening. I had expected this. Barbara let them in, which was her choice, and I met them in the living room on my feet, with Barbara beside me. In a house where I was a guest and not a dependent, Renee spoke first, which also did not surprise me. She was composed in a way that Marcus was not, her voice measured and reasonable. "Dorothy, I think there's been a real misunderstanding about some documents you found. Those were preliminary notes, not a plan. We were exploring options for Maplewood Transitional Living," I said. 40 minutes outside Nashville. Shared accommodations, starting at $550 a month. Family retains billing authorization. I watched her composure flicker. I photographed the documents. Carol Simmons has copies. The room was quiet. Marcus sat down on Barbara's couch like his legs had given out. He looked younger somehow, and more exhausted than I'd ever seen him. Not the strategic, managed version of himself he had been presenting for the past year, but just a tired man who knew he was caught. "Mom," he said, "I know how it looks. Tell me how it looks to you," I said. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you and your wife drafted a document to transfer my home into your control, arranged to move me to a facility where you would retain access to my finances, and plan to execute all of it without my knowledge or consent." He didn't argue with this. That, at least, told me something. "We were underwater," he said finally. "We have been for 2 years. The house, the cars, the kids' school. Renee's parents think we're doing fine, and we've been bleeding ever since I took a pay cut to stay at my firm. He stopped. Tried again. We needed a solution. I was the solution," I said. He didn't answer. "Marcus." I sat down across from him, because I wanted to look him in the eye when I said this, not stand over him. "You could have told me the truth 2 years ago. You could have called me in Cincinnati and said, 'We're struggling. We need help.' I would have helped you. Not because you asked, but because you're my son, and that's what I do. Instead, you invited me into your home under the pretense of caring for my grief, took $1,100 a month from a woman living on a pension, and drafted paperwork to take my house." I paused. "You didn't need to do any of that. You just needed to talk to me." Renee started to say something about how it wasn't that simple, about bills and pressure and hard choices. But Marcus put his hand up. It was the first time I had seen him stop her from speaking in a year and a half. "She's right," he said quietly. "She's right, Renee. They left an hour later without the reconciliation Renee had clearly come, expecting no agreement that I would return, no softening of the legal position, no access restored to my accounts. What they left with was the knowledge that I knew everything and that I had protected myself accordingly. Renee's expression as she walked out was unreadable. Marcus's was not. He looked at the door, like a man who understood for the first time what he had actually done. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. Just that. Nothing else. I told him I heard him. I didn't tell him it was enough. Because it wasn't. Not yet. But I filed it away somewhere alongside the 39 years of things I loved about him, in the part of me that was still his mother and intended to remain so. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Barbara and I fell into an easy routine: coffee in the mornings, dinners when we were both home, long walks through the neighborhood, where every corner held a memory of Robert. I started volunteering 3 days a week at the Cincinnati Public Library, running a reading group for early literacy kids that reminded me, powerfully, why I had loved my career. I saw my own doctor regularly and actually filled my prescriptions on time, which had not been possible in Nashville. I slept without the low ambient tension that I hadn't even recognized as stress until it was gone. My finances, once I had full control of them again, were more stable than I'd realized. The rental income from the Cincinnati house, combined with my pension and Robert's survivor benefit, gave me a modest but genuine independence. I wasn't comfortable in the way that people with savings accounts and investment portfolios are comfortable, but I was not afraid. And the absence of fear, after months of quiet dread, felt like a kind of luxury. 3 months after I left Nashville, Marcus called on a Sunday afternoon. Not a demanding call, not a strategic one. He called the way he used to call when he was in college and just wanted to talk. He told me he and Renee were in couples counseling. He told me Oliver had been asking for me every weekend, and that Sophie had found a way to work my name into conversations about things that had nothing to do with me, which was so entirely Sophie that I had to press my lips together to hold the smile in. "I'm not calling to ask you to come back," he said. "I just wanted you to know that I've been thinking about what you said, about how you would have helped if I just asked." He was quiet for a moment. I think I knew that. I think that's actually why I didn't ask, because asking would have meant admitting we'd failed, and I couldn't do that. I had been thinking about forgiveness since the night I left his house, not the easy sweep-it-under-the-rug version, but the real kind, the kind that costs something and doesn't pretend the wound wasn't there. I had decided that forgiveness, for me, meant choosing not to let what he did define every future moment between us. It did not mean forget again. It did not mean removing the protections I had put in place. It did not mean returning to any arrangement that made me financially dependent on someone else's goodwill, but it might mean eventually Sunday phone calls. And, in time, perhaps visits on my terms, in neutral places, with my dignity intact. "I'd like to see Oliver and Sophie," I said. "When you're ready, and when Renee is ready, I'd like us to work something out for the children's sake." "Yeah," Marcus said. His voice was rougher than usual. "Yeah, I'd like that too." We didn't resolve everything that afternoon. We didn't restore what had been lost. And I wasn't naive enough to think that trust, once broken this thoroughly, could be rebuilt in a single phone call. But it was a beginning, and not a false one. Not the kind that papers over damage and calls it healing. The real kind, which starts with two people acknowledging clearly what happened and choosing, with full knowledge of the cost, to try anyway. That evening, I sat on Barbara's small back porch and watched the light go out of the sky over Cincinnati. The air smelled like November, cold and clean and familiar. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor's kids were playing in a yard, their voices carrying in the dark. I thought about Robert. I thought about the way he used to say that people are capable of their best and their worst. Sometimes within the same year. Sometimes within the same day. He'd been talking about a difficult student at the school where I worked, but it applied just as well to sons, to daughters-in-law, to anyone we loved despite the evidence. I thought about what I had learned in the past 2 years, not the lessons about reading documents carefully before signing them, or keeping your own bank account, or never confusing love with leverage, though all of those were true. The deeper lesson, the one I wanted to say out loud so that anyone watching who recognized their own life in this story might hold on to it. Your dignity cannot be taken from you. Not by people who see you as a monthly deposit. Not by silence that makes itself comfortable in your own home. Not by children who forgot, somewhere along the way, that they were once utterly dependent on you and that a debt of that particular kind doesn't appear on any spreadsheet. Your dignity can be pressured, minimized, crowded out, but it lives in you, and when you choose to claim it back, no one can stop you. I was 64 years old. I had gray in my hair and a blood pressure prescription and a scar on my left hand from a kitchen accident in 1987. I had buried my husband, moved 3 states away on a grief-softened impulse, handed over my autonomy piece by piece, been publicly dismissed from my own son's Thanksgiving table, and still found my way back to my own life. It is never too late to stand up. That's the thing I want you to remember. If you've ever felt like a financial convenience in someone else's home, if you've ever signed something without reading it because you trusted someone and paid for that trust, if you've ever sat at the end of a table and felt yourself becoming invisible to the people who are supposed to see you most clearly, this story is for you. Comment below and tell me if you've been through something like this. And if you're watching right now and you're in the middle of it, still trying to convince yourself it's not as bad as it feels, trust what you know. You already know. If this story stayed with you, you might also want to watch what happens when a mother-in-law finally stops keeping the secret she's been keeping for 20 years. Or the story of the sister who found out, the hard way, what was really in the will. Both of them are waiting for you on this channel.